Well folks, we get another old repair and startup for today. This time it's a 1955 Winco generator with a Briggs and Stratton model 14B engine in it. I ended up getting this from an estate that I ended up cleaning out with a bunch of other stuff. I don't know if you guys saw that giant pile of chainsaws behind the gravely in the last video. That's where all those came from too, but this was in the back in a storeroom and I sure as heck couldn't pass it up for the price. So for nearest I can figure, it's a 2,000 watt generator. It's in pretty fair shape too. Ended up power washing it the other day and it cleaned up fairly nice. Just had a lot of grease and crap on it. I do believe it's missing the belt guard on the back, which is unfortunate because it did have a pretty neat logo on it. I did find another video on YouTube of a guy that has one of these, but it has a different framework underneath that holds it, but he also has the belt guard on it too. So I don't think this is going to take all that long to get going. The gas tank is nice and dry and clean in it, unlike that simplicity that we ended up going through with the Model 14. So it's probably just going to take touching up the points, a quick carb clean, and I think this thing will be ready to light off. And with any luck, maybe that generator head will still put out power. So we'll have to see. So anyways, let's get this shroud pulled off of here, and we can get that flywheel popped off and just check the coil and everything and make sure that's all squared away. Well folks, you watched me pull enough of these fan shrouds off, so for the sake of time, what do you say we speed this up a little bit? And there you have it, shroud and flywheel are both off. So I did notice this when I pulled the shroud off yesterday actually to wash it, because I wanted to make sure I could wash behind the flywheel, is that there was some of this goop stuck to the bottom of the shroud, so I figured that the coil ended up melting. And as you can see, the plastic or rubber, whatever they used to wrap up the coil, probably started to melt when I got hot out in the summer, or just because it was getting downright old, because unfortunately I have seen this happen on other ones before. And it ended up dripping down the back of the flywheel, ended up pooling it up in the bottom, and of course all onto the shroud and everything else. So with any luck, the coil is still good, and it's just a plastic around it that melted off. So what I'm going to do is just take a razor and see about cutting this big chunk off of here, that way it's out of the way of the magnet, and then we can get the points cleaned up, put the flywheel back on it, and see if we still have spark out of this coil. I don't believe I have any more of those bar coils here. I got the horseshoe type, but I don't have any of the bar ones. I know I can get them through one of my parts suppliers, but of course I'd really rather not have to order anything for this, folks. I'd rather just get the thing fired up and see if it'll run. So anyways, we'll get that thing trimmed up and then we can take a look at the points. Alright, we got our coil all trimmed up and our flywheel's all back on there. So now we can pull this points cover off and take a look behind it. And it already looks like somebody rigged up their own homemade kill switch, judging by this plastic piece here. Yep, because you can see somebody re-riveted the spring on the inside of it. And there's supposed to be a solid plastic button on the outside here, but what this little clip thing is when you buy a points ignition system for, let's say, a 60, I think that's a 60600 series Briggs, the one with the under the flywheel ignition system, they send you this little plastic clip so you can push the spring down on the condenser to push the wires through. And from the looks of it, somebody rigged up their own kill switch with that, so they must have lost the plastic button out of it at some point. There's a little bit of water in there from when I power washed it yesterday, but that's alright. So the points themselves, those look alright, those are still usable. We're just going to have to blow some of the moisture off of this thing and touch those up with some 400 grit, and I think those will be good to go. Didn't clean up too bad. We still have a small bit of corrosion on there. You can see a little bit of a dull white spot towards the bottom, because they're just pitted just a little bit, and of course the receiving one on the other side has just about the same nick on it. But there's still enough shiny material there where they'll still mate up okay, and we'll have good connection between those 2 points. So the last thing we have to do to the ignition system is just check the points gap. So these Briggs Model 14s, like most of the Briggs with points, all get set to 20 thousandths. So I got my feeler gauge here. And those are actually a little bit wide, so we're going to have to close those up a bit. And on these ones, all you have to do is you have to loosen this middle screw here, which clamps everything down, and then you have an offset up top here, which you turn, and that will oscillate this piece of insulator plate and move these points in and out like so. That way you can get the proper adjustment to them. And then of course you have the tedious endeavor of getting the plate clamped down and having it stay in the right spot. Alright, here we go, folks. Hopefully the camera picked that up. I know it's a pretty darn big spark on there. Nice and blue and hot, so that'll fire up that gas real nice. Folks, you just don't get sparks like that on new equipment nowadays. No, sir. So the last thing that we have to do is just check out this fuel system on this thing. I believe I mentioned the gas tank on here is nice and clean. I do have to blow some of the dust out of it, just from a little bit of dried gas, but it's nothing like the gas tank that was on that Simplicity that we went through. Air cleaner oils, you know, it's a little bit black, but it's not too bad. So I'm just going to pull this whole carburetor right off of here and get it split apart on the bench, and we can take a look inside. If I had to make a rough guess, I'm assuming that it's fairly decent inside, given the condition of the tank and everything else. But we'll have to see what it entails when we open it up. I also noticed this too when I was washing it. If you guys will be able to see it. Back of the intake tube is split apart where the pinch weld is. I don't know if that's going to pop back in there, but not too big of a deal at this point. Well folks, if you remember from the Simplicity carburetor that we took apart, just to go over this again, you do have to take out the main jet in the bottom here, or the needle rather, and ooh, that's a little bit crispy down in there. And then you have to take out the main jet that goes through the body, because it runs through like so. It goes through the bottom and the top half, which you can split these carburetors apart without pulling that main jet out. It's not easy to do, and there's a very good chance you can break the stem, so you got to be very careful doing that. And of course it also helps if you modify a screwdriver like this one. I shaved the sides off of either one, that way you can fit it down inside of that main jet, and with any luck not strip it out. And this one didn't come loose. There's some dry white powdery gas in there, so the bowl might have to go through the glass bead blaster. We'll see. Well, you can't complain with that, folks. So the top of the needle is fairly clean. It was just the bottom of it that had a little bit of powdery residue on it, as you can see. So that'll be nice and easy to clean up. And now we can take the bolts out of here and split the body apart. Well, aside from a little bit of water that got in there, once again from power washing yesterday, that looks pretty darn good in there, folks. Could probably just run some steel wool through that bowl. I shouldn't even have to touch it with the glass bead blaster. Sure beats pulling them apart when they're all full of shellac and crust and corrosion and everything else. So we'll just get that scrubbed out, and then I can start putting it back together with some new gaskets. Bowl cleaned up fairly nice on the inside. I don't know if you guys will be able to see it, but it's nice shiny, well, fairly shiny aluminum again. All that dry powdery gas is gone. I ended up cleaning up the top half. I scraped off the old gasket, as you can see, and I got a new one on there now, which fit nicely. So now I just have to mount up the float, which is still in nice shape. Set that, and then I can get the body back together. So before I put this carburetor back together, I am going to adjust this float. As you can see on this side, it's a little bit higher than it is on the back over here. And you can also see a U-shaped tang underneath that float. For those of you who don't know, you have to bend that tang to get this side of the float to come down a little bit, because all these Briggs floats sit level, so they're going to be even on either side. So I just have to go in there with a small screwdriver, hold the float up just a little bit, and push up on the tang. That's a little bit closer. I'm gonna have to do this off camera so I can hold it properly. Alright, so that's a little bit better there. As you can see, we're fairly level straight across, and it's equal on both sides. So when you bend that tang, you don't want to just push down on it, because then you'll push right into the needle. So you just want to make sure that you hold it up, get the screwdriver on there, and you can pivot off the side of the body like so to bend that up and get everything back into adjustment. And with that, now we can start putting this here carburetor body back together. So I got my main jet all cleaned up, and along with the port that it goes into, that's all cleaned up. So that can get threaded back in there, which actually, before that goes in, once again, just gonna send a little bit of oil down there, that way it doesn't get jammed up. This is one thing you don't want to have to either easy out or use a Dremel and kind of cut it all out of there. They're a real pain in the neck when they get stripped out. And the best way, well, that ended up making it into the other side. Sometimes when you put these back in, there's a hole that it has to go into over here, which is for the idle jet. And when they go in, sometimes they'll hit the side of the ventry and they'll start to ride up it instead of going into the port. So you got to make sure that when you put this jet back in, look in through the top and make sure it ends up going into that hole for the idle port, rather than hitting the side of the ventry and then just bending and going upwards, because it's got a ways to go to get in there. And lastly, of course, the main jet needle, which I did pull this apart, and I'm not going to repack this like we did on the Gravely on the last video. There is a leather gasket inside of here, or leather packing rather, and it is still pliable enough. I put some oil on it and tightened this jam nut down, and it was able to seal still, so I'm not going to worry about putting new leather packing in there at this point in time, as long as it seals okay. Okay, so that's bottomed out. So these carburetors, I'll usually set this bottom one on these ones to 1.5 out, give or take, and then I'll turn out the idle jet here, which I never removed this one because I figured it was clean as a whistle inside. And it is. I'll usually turn these out about 1 turn and then make the initial adjustment once everything's running. So that'll go out 1. Alright, so now I just have to get a flange gasket for this, and then we'll be ready to mount the carburetor back up onto the engine. Carburetor is all mounted back up, so before I hook up the fuel line, I am going to pull this glass fuel bowl filter apart and clean out the glass, make sure the screen is all scrubbed out, and also put a new bowl gasket in there, so that way the glass seals. I don't believe I'm going to have to pull it off and run it through the glass bead blaster, because given the condition of the inside of the fuel tank, this should be all set inside and just need a quick blow on out. I also have to blow out some of the junk inside of the fuel tank. There is some light crusty stuff still left in there, but it's nothing like that Simplicity was, luckily, and there's still shiny metal like this on the inside. So at least somebody didn't leave gas in it for all those years. So we'll get that stuff cleaned up. And after that, I'll get the shroud back onto this thing, get everything wrapped up, and we can slide it outside and see if we can light this thing off. Well, never get too far ahead of yourselves, folks. Just when you think you're going to get everything back together and running again quick. I pulled the bowl off of it. That's really not all that bad to deal with. That'll scrub out of there just fine. But, folks, that's going to have to go through the glass bead blaster and get a new screen in there. That's really bad. A lot worse than I figured it was going to be. Not as bad as some of them that I've pulled out, but sure as ever isn't great. So I'll get that screen scraped out of there, and then we can get this back in. Now we're all ready to fire up. Fuel bowl is all glass bead blasted off and rebuilt. I ended up punching out new leather packing for the shutoff. I have a new gasket for the glass bowl, and we're full of gas and nothing's leaking out, so pretty darn happy about that, along with the carburetor too. So just for kicks, I pulled the cover off of the generator here just to check and make sure there was no water in there from when I power washed it. That's good and dry. I also pulled off this little cover where the slip rings are on the end of the generator, and that's all squared away and nice and dry too. So since we have gas on this thing, now folks, we can finally bring this thing outside and give the rope a pull and see what happens. Currently got about a 500 watt load on it with the spotlight. Unfortunately the gauge doesn't really work too well. It's jumping around, but it is maintaining fairly consistent power at about 115, 116 volts. It also blows pretty good smoke rings too, if you can see them. Well, I guess we know now why this thing was brought to the repair shop and it never left. The thing smokes like a son of a gun, that's for sure. Definitely wasn't expecting it to smoke that heavily, but I suppose an old piece of equipment that's been used quite a bit. As you can see, the rope start pulley's nice and shiny, so this thing definitely got a lot of use over the years. But aside from that, the engine runs nice, it was smooth, really wasn't knocking much. Who knows what the camera really picked up. The generator head does put out power, despite the needle gauge really not working out too well. I know the glass was biffed on it, and the needle was flopping around everywhere, but the multimeter showed a nice steady 115 to 120 volts, so I was happy about that. So I'm not really all too sure what I'm going to do with this yet. When I first found it up there, my intention was to pull the engine off of it and sell the generator head in the base and just keep the engine because it's a nice clean Model 14 Briggs. But I've already got a whole mess of generators here, and I still have another Kohler light plant that I got to get to for a repair and startup at some point. That's in fairly nice shape, runs off a single cylinder Kohler, but we'll have to find a home for this one amongst all the other stuff up on the hill someplace. So anyway folks, there you have it. That's the repair and startup of the 1955 Winco generator.